Right, so what we're going to look at in this video is the section C part of the Russia paper, looking at the controversy study. Obviously the sections A and B are just your standard essays, A being a bit smaller in time frame, B being the wider time frame questions. And then section C is on the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so you'll get a question something like this. This was from the 2018 paper. But it won't be far different in terms of structure of the question. But the big difference is that they can ask you about any of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed and the issues relating around that. So here we've got, in the light of differing interpretations, how convincing do you find the view that the USSR collapsed in 91 because of the consequences of Gorbachev's political reforms? Okay. Now, really, they tell you what you need to do here. You need to explain your answer, analyse and evaluate the material in both extracts, and use your own knowledge of the issues. So basically what they want to see is that you are able to answer that question. So to what extent was it, or how convincing do you find the view that it collapsed because of the consequences of Gorbachev's political reforms? You've got to answer that as an essay question. But in doing that, you need to incorporate the sources within that and base your arguments on the sources that are provided, to evaluate the material in both extracts using your own knowledge. So they're really expecting a blend here of your own knowledge, source use, and your evaluation, your judgment, your overall view. So I'm not going to read through the sources in total, in completion, but you can always pause the video and have a look at these first if you want to. So here's two extracts. One from Hosking focuses predominantly on Gorbachev's political reforms, and you'll often find this. There'll be one source that primarily focuses on the factor in the question. So in this case, there's quite a few different interesting quotes. Talks about the election to the Supreme Soviets of the Union Republics. You've got the creation of the post of president of the USSR, the fact that Gorbachev never won an election. So there's quite a few different things there. But as we're reading it, we'll see at the bottom here that then there's this last bit here where it says this lack of either symbolic or actual authority undermined him fatally over the next 18 months as economic crisis and inter-ethnic conflict engulfed his reform programme. So there's also kind of a few links to some potential other arguments there. Now, as we move to extract 2, again, we're not going to read through it, but we can see that mostly it's about the economy. Okay, so perestroika, what that was. It says things like only the dismantling of the planned economy could have solved the crisis. The 500-day plan is mentioned. The cooperatives leading to inflation. So again, loads of points there that could link to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now the thing is when you're reading through the sources, you always want to be thinking, what could I use that I would then link to why it collapsed? You're not just being asked to evaluate what the sources are saying, you're using the sources to then link back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the structure here that you would probably end up following for these two is maybe a paragraph, well, you definitely have a paragraph on the political consequences, the political reforms, and how they led to the collapse, because that's the main factor in the question. And then you probably deal with the economy next, because of the fact that there's a whole source pretty much dedicated to it, and it's mentioned briefly in source 1. The third point for this one's quite a challenging one. Different things would be credited. Inter-ethnic conflict is an area you could focus on. But you could also focus on Gorbachev's lack of legitimacy itself, or something else. But I think inter-ethnic conflict would probably be your best bet. Now what we're going to do now is read through a model response, and in doing so, show you why this answer gets a high level. And you can always we'll go through the introduction first, I'll talk you through why that's a high level, and then when we go through the other paragraphs, you can always pause it, have a look back through that paragraph, compare it to ones you've written, and see if they match up. So this is their introduction. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 due to the complex web of crises that arose during Gorbachev's time in power, culminating in the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States and the final collapse on 31st of January 1991. So fairly simple starting sentence there, just outlining what they define to be the actual collapse of the Soviet Union, that collapse on the 31st of January 1991. Historians such as Hosking clearly emphasise Gorbachev's political reforms as being the primary driver behind the collapse, due to fatally weakening the Communist Party and the lack of legitimacy that Gorbachev had by the end of 1991, resulting in collapse. So, I'm going to mark yellow as being what we've got for our source use. So, where they've extracted arguments from the sources, where they've extracted quotes, that I'm going to highlight in yellow. So clearly there, they've managed to pull it out. I would say at the latest, the second sentence of your introduction should mention the extracts. You should be pulling the arguments from the extracts and identifying what those historians argue, or at least what their sources can be used to illuminate. However, other historians have emphasised the more convincing argument. Now this is interesting, because that's evaluative. The more convincing argument, okay? And then they go on to say where that's found, so that the economic problems both embedded with the command economy in Gorbachev's reforms caused the collapse as the decisions made came, quote, too late to halt the economic crash, which fueled the calls for the end of the Soviet Union. So whilst they haven't explicitly linked that to the source, they should have really linked that to extract 2, but there we go. They've still extracted that argument. But that idea of evaluation is there, where they've said actually they find something else more convincing. Then they identify the third argument they're going to be talking about. Finally, other arguments such as the inter-ethnic conflict presented by Feiges and the rise in nationalism, including figures such as Yeltsin, undermined him, are somewhat strong. And then they finish their introduction with a really clear bit of evaluation. However, so they make sure they really give their judgment here. However, both the political reforms and the rise of nationalism were essentially caused by the economic problems faced by Gorbachev, suggesting that rather than focusing on democratization and glasnost, as Hosking does, the emphasis should be on the economy. Really strong, because they give you a judgment, a very clear judgment. So that's what a good introduction should look like. It's quite long, could potentially be a bit shorter, but they've identified the arguments from the sources, they've identified the evidence that could be used to suggest the factor in the question is the most compelling or convincing argument, but then they've told me what their overall view is, and they've used the other source to do that. So let's go through what a good paragraph would look like. The argument that Gorbachev's political reforms caused the collapse of the USSR is somewhat convincing, as the platform Gorbachev gave to his opponent and removal of his own, and the Communist Party's legitimacy, which led to the eventual collapse. So really, that is a nice topic sentence that's nice and evaluative. The argument that I've been presented with in the question is somewhat convincing, so that's suggesting to us that they don't find it wholly convincing, it's not absolutely convincing, it's partially convincing. But they're still identifying why it is somewhat convincing. Hosking identifies the problem that arose from Gorbachev, as Gorbachev legalised the formation of alternative political parties during a period when elections to the Supreme Soviets of the republics were imminent. So clearly that is source use. Okay, they brought in some quotes from the sources. Hosking identifies. It's a good way of using a phrase to get you to look at a source. This historian identifies the problem. Okay, this was one of many that led to Gorbachev being seen as to, quote, lack the legitimacy required to lead the Union. So they've kind of used a bit of analysis there, but they're still referring to the sources. Then they're going to dive into the other thread that we need to see in your answers, which is contextual knowledge. Okay. Indeed, by the end of 1990, elections to the local Soviets had seen communist candidates defeated across the country, with individuals such as Yeltsin forming new groups such as Democratic Platform in the elections for the Russian Congress of People's Deputies, and becoming a genuine threat to communist dominance in elected chambers. The elections galvanised opposition, as revealed by Yeltsin resigning from the party in the Communist Party in June, and emerged as a new leader to rival Gorbachev. So, what colour should we do for that? Let's do green. So the green is their own knowledge there. Using the phrase indeed allows them to kind of show that they're agreeing with what the source is saying and they're supporting what's being said. Then it goes on. As Hosking suggests, Gorbachev's decision to create the presidency further reveals how his political reforms led to the collapse, and how he highlights how Gorbachev had himself, quote, had himself elected by the Congress of People's Deputies. So again, nice little bit of source use, good inference, good use of the source. And then we go back to the contextual knowledge again. So you're starting to see a pattern forming. This position was initially intended to be elected by popular vote, but again, Gorbachev revealed his lack of confidence by this stage and ensured he would be given the position. This had a damning impact on the legitimacy of the Communist Party, and arguably was the material opponents like Yeltsin would need to build support and eventually ban the Communist Party and dismantle the Soviet Union. Notice that they use that phrase, the collapse, dismantle of the Soviet Union, yeah? Effectively, what you want to keep doing is, in your answer, keep coming back to that concept of collapsing the Union, which led to the collapse because of this, which, you know, the more you do that, the better your answer will be. Then, they've got a lovely bit of evaluation. Whilst it may be argued that Gorbachev was aiming to reinvigorate the USSR with his political reforms, so acknowledging that actually maybe it's a bit harsh to blame him, and somewhat achieved this with the initial introduction of glasnost, his latter policy simply handed power to his opponents and played a crucial role in the collapse. So again, coming back to that concept of the collapse. So they've dealt with the factor in the question there, they've got an evaluative topic sentence, they then go on to pull something from the sources, show their contextual knowledge and how that supports what's being said, again using something from the sources, again agreeing or disagreeing based on their contextual knowledge, and then a bit of evaluation right at the end there, really to summarise their overall view about that paragraph. However, the more convincing argument is that the economic crash or economic crises highlighted by both Feiges and Hosking and the poor economic reforms developed throughout the late 1980s were more significant than Gorbachev's political reforms, as they drove the discontent that made democratization problematic. What a topic sentence. Clearly they're linking back to the question, they're linking to the idea of how convincing the arguments are, and they've quoted the sources to present another argument and say why it's more convincing. Yeah, good. They get a good amount of marks very quickly for that sentence. Okay. So maybe have a look at your own topic sentences and look at that one and think, okay, how similar is it to that? Do I think that my topic sentences are that strong? Do I really show my judgment in there? So Feiges identifies that Gorbachev's lack of substantial planning led to food shortages of food and essential household goods that led to discontent throughout the republics and Russia itself. The legislation of cooperatives in 1988 led to an explosion of cafes, restaurants, shops, but this not only failed to ease shortages, but extended them. Now they actually kind of blend their contextual knowledge in with their source analysis here, because this next bit is all their knowledge here. So again, you notice this very similar structure here for this paragraph. As products were diverted from state shops where prices were low to cooperatives that charged a much higher price, Gorbachev failed in his promise for an improvement in consumer goods, and strikes began to occur throughout the country, such as coal miners, due to the rise of inflation, meaning for many living standards were decreasing. Really good. So now what they're going to do, they're going to identify something else. Feiges also identifies that the dismantling of the planned economy would have solved the crisis, which reveals how Gorbachev's indecision was critical to the collapse. Following the State Commission on Economic Reform, divisions split in the Politburo occurred, and while Shatilin put forward the 500 days programme, the plan was rejected by the Soviet government but accepted by the Russian parliament, which led to chaos and the collapse of the economy, arguably through the economy declining by 1/5 between 1990 and 1991. Sorry, let me go through that again. So we've got their own knowledge here. Following the State Commission on Economic Reform, division splits in the Politburo occurred, and while Shatilin put forward the 500 days programme, the plan was rejected by the Soviet government but accepted by the Russian parliament, which led to chaos and the collapse of the economy. Arguably, through the economy declining by 1/5 between 1990 and 1991, was more significant in the collapse as it fueled the anger towards Gorbachev that undermined his political power, thereby suggesting it was not mostly his political reforms. So again, you've got this kind of sandwich here of evaluation, using the sources, using your knowledge in order to support what you said in that first sentence, and then coming back to that at the end. So then they go on for their final paragraph. Finally, whilst not primarily discussed by either historian but briefly highlighted, the role of nationalism and inter-ethnic conflict galvanised the desire for independence from the Soviet Union and was the vessel that disenchantment took. Now really, would have been better there to have a link to the political reforms, because that's what the question's on, but it's still a good topic sentence. Could be better, but it's still good. Arguably, it was the nationalist movements that fundamentally changed the Soviet Union, as it was the republics gaining independence that led to its collapse. Okay, so that's still a bit of evaluation. So they're saying, arguably, you could say it was that rather than the political reforms. A range of inter-ethnic conflicts began to spread, so we know that that phrase is taken from the source. But arguably only with a reduction in living standards caused by the economic problems. So you'll notice that this paragraph seems to be a lot more evaluative. As early as 1986, Gorbachev's political reforms led to riots in Kazakhstan in 1986 due to the replacement of local leaders by a Russian, but ethnic tensions in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan in 1989 and 90 respectively destabilised the power of the communists more fundamentally, and the economic conditions drove these tensions. So we've really got a mixture of evaluation in there, because then they're coming back to their overall argument, which was that it was economic tensions. Without the heavy investment from the Soviet republics, nationalist movements spread. Arguably, these powers then destroyed the Soviet Union through their independence, but without Gorbachev providing them with legitimacy and the economic conditions allowing the nationalist movements to thrive, this would not have been the primary driver for collapse. So they make sure that last paragraph, they haven't got loads of quotes to mention, but they bring in a bit of their contextual knowledge, and they very clearly link it back to an evaluation of how relevant that factor was. And they say, well, it is relevant, it clearly led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but without Gorbachev giving them power, and without the economic problems that led to Gorbachev releasing democracy, or kind of providing democracy to the people, you wouldn't have had that rise in nationalism, so it's not as important. So now let's just see how they wrap up their essay. In conclusion, it is convincing to argue that Gorbachev's political reforms fundamentally undermined the power of the CCP, also the CP, Communist Party, and his own power. However, this was not inevitable. So they acknowledge why political reforms were important, but then they go on to say this was not inevitable. So clearly they're going to point out something else. What do you think that's going to be based on the rest of their essay? Of course, it's going to be about the economy. They said in their introduction the economy was more convincing. They said in their paragraph about economy that it was more convincing, so that's what we expect to play out. It was the mismanagement of the economy and subsequent economic crisis that led to those political reforms proving to be so problematic, and driving the nationalist feeling and inter-ethnic tension that led to the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States in 1991 and the destruction of the Soviet Union. So again, we'll put that in bold. There's another one here, wasn't there? Driver for collapse. So destruction of the Soviet Union. So we're back down here. So clearly that sentence there really encapsulates their argument, their overall argument. But now they have to link it back to the statement they were given, or the question they were given, which was about political reforms. Therefore, it is not wholly convincing that the USSR collapsed because of the consequence of Gorbachev's political reforms, as without the failed economic reforms and subsequent rise of nationalism, the Soviet Union may not have collapsed in 1991. Now that answer could be better. We see answers that have kind of, get 1,300 words, 1,400 words, that maybe potentially would look a lot better on paper because they can put a bit more contextual knowledge in. But I know a lot of students are worried about how much they need to write in the time given. And so if you can structure your answer similar to this and provide an answer similar to this, you'll be getting up to that level 5 territory, okay? So you notice when you flick through this, everything is relevant. It's either evaluation in the blue, you've got the identifying arguments from the source in yellow, and then their contextual knowledge in the green. And you'll notice that No, sorry, that should have been in green there. Yeah. And so when you look at it like that, you can clearly see a different balance in the paragraphs, but in every paragraph features the same things. And apart from their conclusion, which is very evaluative. They still identify some stuff from the sources, but none of it's new. So that's how you answer that section C source question. So what I'd recommend doing is just going through, planning as many of them as you can, making sure your knowledge is good enough so that then when you're answering that question, your contextual knowledge is really, really strong when you're presenting your argument. Hopefully that's been helpful. Send me any messages if you need to, but thank you for watching.